So what I'd like to ask you is, how do you see environmental activism as integrated with spiritual life?
Thank you. That's a lovely question. I have to say, on a personal level, I've never seen a division between those two things. Ever since I can remember, I come from a very small place called Sikkim in the eastern Himalayas, and I grew up for many parts of my childhood for several years in wilderness areas. There are lots of jokes in my family about how much I love nature from a very small, from a very young age. And for me, whenever I come from a family of Tibetan Buddhist practitioners, my mother and my grandmother both took their vows and became nuns later in their life. So I was a young child growing up with nuns, essentially, and had to go through a lot of training, as you can imagine, being near them. And every time they would start teaching me meditation, I would find myself looking out of the window and just disappearing in the trees, just understanding everything they were teaching me and being able to almost find a shortcut to what they were describing as this place of equanimity or this place of bliss by, in some sense, dissolving myself in nature. And that meant that ever since I can remember, I had the sense that I was a part of nature. So in my spiritual practice, it was just very natural for me to always start my interdependence practice in that space. And with no surprise, I went on to become a professional environmental scientist and program manager. And for a long time, I felt that I had to hide the spiritual part of my life in my professional world, especially because I work in the US and I was trained in this very Euro-derived Western education system. I felt almost ashamed, or in some sense that I would disqualify myself as a professional scientist. But at some point, it all had to come together. And since then, what I've learned is that in no way am I unique. Actually, I think all environmentalists have had a spiritual part of an awakening, a spiritual awakening, where they realize that the meaning of their own lives is, the meaning of their own lives comes from their desire to serve the greater sense of self. And that greater sense of self really is, for many of us, it comes from this understanding that just on a very practical level, there can be no humans without nature. We are part of nature. And this idea that we are somehow superior to nature has actually been the cause of so much harm. It has been the cause of so much injustice and so much damage, right? Not just in real terms. I mean, it has damaged the entire world, but also psychologically, it's caused so much harm. We have a kind of polarization that exists in our modern day societies that are incredibly toxic. And I think going back to this idea of spiritual identity and, in some sense, environmental activism being integrated, to me, that healing of that dualism and the healing of that harm that has happened has to begin there. My interpretation, so of course, I know you will know, but the Bodhisattva vow, our interpretation, right, when we imagine it and when we are visualizing how we embody that vow, for me, there is no greater embodiment than trying to literally save all life on earth. So if the vow is, may I alleviate the suffering of all sentient beings, to be an environmental activist is to embody that vow in every part of that vow, because we are, first of all, not just thinking about our loved ones. We're not just thinking about our families. We're thinking about all humankind. And then we're not just thinking about humankind, we're thinking about all these millions of species that exist on this planet. Human beings are just one species. It's said that there are maybe 1 million species of just insects, beetles that we don't know about, that we haven't even identified yet. And I think when I ground myself in the Bodhisattva vow, then I feel very protected from hopelessness, because I find myself in this space of awe. I'm just like, really, there is no other term than saying I'm blown away. I'm blown away by how magnificent life is on Earth. Just the other day, I was reading about how whales, just by existing in the ocean, they sequester carbon. They are a climate change solution just by existing, right? And so the awe that I'm filled with really comes from my understanding that some of us, our human species, has to work very hard to live up to a bodhisattva vow. But there are species that effortlessly are bodhisattvas. And so if we were to see them that way, that a species can exist and just by exist be an environmental problem, a solution to an environmental problem, what does that teach me as a practitioner, right? First of all, it teaches me so much humility for the human species, but then I think what it teaches me is that this is the path to Buddhahood, that being an environmentalist actually is a path to Buddhahood, and that nature all around me is teaching me that it is Buddhism. You want to talk about compassion, it is effortlessly here. You want to talk about interdependence, it is effortlessly here. You want to talk about, emptiness, it is effortlessly here. Impermanence, effortlessly displayed, right? And so I personally cannot distinguish the difference between my spiritual practice and environmental activism. But I also think that we are at a moment in time where a lot of people are integrating these two things and being called as spiritual people to protect nature and to protect, whether they call it creation, right? A lot of Christians, for example, think of it as creation. God created the earth. Therefore, it is their responsibility to protect it. It doesn't matter, I think, what religion people have, as long as they see that all life is precious and they decide to embody their spiritual values to protect nature.
So in the English-speaking world, there's a substantial focus now on eco-dharma that's coming, to the fore. And as a result, the way that Buddhist approaches and practices get applied in relation to ecology or environmental justice naturally tend to be suited to the perspective of the global north. And that means to the perspective of those who have amassed and enjoyed and controlled the most power and wealth from the exploitation of the natural world. Mm-hmm. So what changes when we are Buddhists situated in the global south, which is more likely to be at whose expense the power and wealth was amassed in the first place, and where we're most likely to pay the highest cost of the climate and environmental crisis?
Mm. This is an amazing question. I just want to say that first. As a systems thinker, the first thing I really want to say is environmental collapse, climate change, these are all products of dualistic, extractive, exploitative systems. Colonialism is one of those systems. And one of the things about this system is that it is deliberately unjust. It's not that injustice happened by chance. Actually, these systems are deliberately designed to be unjust so that people who don't have power, the throwaway people, bear the burden. The injustice is the point of these systems, because then what happens is the people who created these systems can continue to control and thrive while making the majority of the global population bear that burden. And I think, that those impacts have only intensified as time has gone on. A lot of people I know here, especially in North America, love to talk about colonialism as if it happened 200, 300 years ago, and it's like, it's active right now. What is globalization, right? What is neoliberalism? Where you walk into a grocery store anywhere in the West, I love to use this example. It looks so wealthy and rich and diverse. You walk into the cereal aisle, there are 100 boxes with different logos and different brands. But actually, pretty much that entire grocery store is owned by 10 companies. There's a very famous Oxfam study that actually broke this down. For those of you who are interested, you can Google it and find this information. So who really is benefiting, right? That is such an illusion of diversity that they're giving us, that they tell the global South, this is what we should aspire to. When we think about economic growth, this is what we're supposed to get. That kind of the 100 cereal boxes in the grocery aisle. When in reality, there are 10 companies and the owners and shareholders of those 10 companies that are making all the money, right? And the price that we pay for those boxes, the amount of waste, the amount of corn that is grown, right? The amount of diversity that is lost, the amount of sort of just food waste and hunger that we create in these systems, the exploitative systems, like who ends up, it doesn't actually improve our lives in any way. But we have been in the global South fed this fantasy that this is what economic development is. And on an individual level, success is having 2 cars, 2 houses, 5 houses, 10 houses, right? It's like never ending, this idea that growth just keeps happening forever and ever and ever. And I think those of us who are in the global South, who've come from the global South, who understand very deeply that it is at our expense that this wealth has been amassed, it is at our expense that the global North gets to keep acting like these problems are not happening. I think we have to have a framework of justice front and center. I think we have to unite with all the other have-nots. I think we have to see ourselves as a community when it comes to historically marginalized people, because it is in the interest of the elite to always divide us. It's always in their interest to make sure that our countries are fighting one another for resources, right? As long as we're busy fighting one another, we're never going to challenge them. We're never going to challenge this capitalist system that they've put on all of us. No country escapes it. And so this idea of what success means, this idea of what development means, I think there is no group that is better suited in many ways than Buddhists to ask this question. We who've already understood that life is impermanent and the self is impermanent, like who better than us to demand an answer to, if life is impermanent and our life expectancy is 80 years at best, why is the model of success something around even land ownership? Why do we have a model of extraction where what we leave behind is actually terrible in real terms, right? Terrible for all life on earth, terrible for the new generations to come. It can be hard being an environmentalist, especially, I'm almost 50 now, and especially even people older than me who for decades have been sort of shouting at the top of their lungs, like this is avoidable. This terrifying future of resource wars is avoidable. This terrifying future of climate migration, where more than half of the human population will have to move or they'll die, that is avoidable, right? It can be really hard to understand that people essentially don't like changing. And they don't like changing because all of us, every one of us, is attached to comfort. Why is impermanence so scary for people? Because we want permanence. Permanence is comfort, right? Why does everybody aspire to be in business class, right, when they're flying? Because that's more comfortable, literally. Why does everyone want their own car? It's comfort again. And so this attachment to comfort is very instinctive. It's in our reptilian brain. It's how we survive and how we protect our loved ones. So what can we do to counter that? Because when you have political entities that create, fossil fuel entities that create anti-climate propaganda, for example, and essentially what they say is, it's the individual's burden, right? It's because you fly, that's why climate change is happening. It's because you're not recycling, that's why the earth is going to hell in a handbasket, right? We really have to question, first of all, who is saying that and why they're saying that. Because the reality is we are not the ones who got to design the system. We in the global south especially did not design any of these systems that have been put upon us. But also when we've attempted to redesign the system, when we've attempted to create equitable systems, we have really, I mean, there have been wars to keep us in our place, right? And so I think people often ask me about hope, and my response is always, let's talk about courage. And I think there is, something about Buddhist practice that really strengthens our courage, because we cannot escape the fact that we are in the process of dying. And if you are a Buddhist like me, it's something that always makes me laugh. Like, it's always like, my husband sometimes says it's not funny, but I think it's very funny that we're all dying, It's like, well, there it is. We're just pretending and holding on to our comfort and trying to soothe ourselves. But if you understand Buddhism in a deep way, and if you understand, all the biological systems that make up this earth, you understand that just because we're dying does not mean we do not live forever. Like, you think about nature and how this beautiful planet that we're on, right? And it's like every one of us is recycling continuously. We are born, we live, we die, we decompose, and we become part of something else. And then life is born again. We're constantly creating life in our existence. And so for me, this understanding of, this interpretation of my Buddhist practice means that I feel a great deal of courage, and I feel it's necessary to take on this kind of power structure. And that as Buddhists, we are the ones that can really call for justice, because we understand the inherent suffering and the inherent inequities these systems have caused. There is something about, I think, coming from the global south that immediately orients me. I know what the rest of the world lives like, right? So no matter what is presented to me in North America, I know what the majority of the human population experience. It's something that immediately sort of grounds my thinking, and I think there is so much liberation in us taking pride from the fact that we are from the global south. There is something really liberatory. We don't have to accept the systems that were put upon us. The past is the past and the future is the future, right? There is infinite possibility in every second in the present.
A propósito de lo que dices del sur global, en América Latina, una gran parte del activismo ambiental se preocupa por ganar el derecho a participar en los procesos de tomas de decisiones. ¿Qué nos ofrece el budismo en un contexto donde las personas no tienen voz, o tal vez no ven un camino hacia los espacios donde se toman decisiones sobre el ambiente, o para quienes han sido privadas o privados de sus derechos, que parece incluso normal no tener derechos? O sea, ¿cómo puede el Dharma ayudarnos a reimaginar nuestro lugar en la sociedad o en el mundo, y cómo puede ayudarnos a ocupar ese lugar?
I think I'm going to give an answer that is surprising me. I think for those of us who are trying to change society and are Dharma practitioners, the greatest thing we can offer is creating a framework that is based on love and compassion. I worked for a major environmental NGO for 14 years, and I was trained in a very traditional Western context of what it means to be an environmentalist. And I was successful at it. I had a breaking point for personal and professional reasons. My breaking point personally was that I just had so much environmental, what we now call eco-anxiety and climate distress. I, had trauma symptoms and was having panic attacks and nightmares because I was living I spent all my days working with our teams, looking at climate change projections and understanding what was coming. And that meant I was just living in this state of complete anxiety constantly. The professional break for me came because of the Convention of Parties, which is led by the UN IPCC, so the UN International Panel on Climate Change. And they have a convention of parties where all the governments send their delegations, and there is this big negotiation that happens on climate change. And the COP that happened that year, 2019, was in Copenhagen. They call it Broken Hagen sometimes as a joke. It was such a display of how our governments was not going to save us, and our capitalism was not going to save us. The private sector was not going to save us. And also, sadly, what I realized was the environmental and the climate movement that I knew I'd grown up in, that I was so proud to be a part of, was not going to save us. And a lot of that came for me from this realization that as long as we are in the space of dualism, what happens is that we are living what is sometimes called a gospel of scarcity. If we are in a dualistic framework, what that means is that we're always going to see us and them. We're always going to say it's either or. It's us versus them, right? Who is the us and who is the them? It's man against nature. It's environmentalists against capitalists, right? There was just all of the language was, in fact, funnily enough, what I suddenly woke up to in that year. That year was 2019. Oh, no, 2009. Sorry, 2009, not 2019. Ooh, time flies. 2009. I suddenly woke up and realized that the environmental movement I was in was using incredibly militaristic terms, that was just part of our everyday life. We would say we are in a climate war and we're losing the battle. This was you'll hear it everywhere. It's in the headlines all the time. And I suddenly woke up thinking, what if we weren't adopting this dynamic? What if we were not coming from a place of fear, but coming from a place of love? What changes for me when I come from a place of love? And I think this for me this comes only from Dharma practice, this understanding, right? That when we come from a place of love, we're immediately in a space of plenty, in a space of enoughness. We're no longer saying, okay, resources are scarce, everyone for themselves, let's protect who we can, And for the next few years, I was doing a lot of disaster preparedness management and training with faith leaders, in particular, religious leaders. And it was very easy to note how gendered the response often was, and also how racial the response often was. I found that it was Black, Indigenous women of color whose response was always to say, well, I can't leave. I have to take care of my grandfather, or I have to take care of my neighbor, or there is this kid down the street who comes to my house every day with my son who I will be worried about, right? It was always women of color that were saying, I cannot go to a safe place and leave this place that is dangerous, because I first have to make sure that everyone around me is safe. And to me, what I then wanted to build and what I've ended up working on since 2009 is imagining a way of working and a world where we actually focus and start and center the most vulnerable people. If we were to, there is this concept, especially in architecture, that I learned about a few years ago, and it's called designing for access. And essentially, the idea is if you are building a public structure and you design so that building has access to the people who are most disabled. So let's say people who need wheelchairs. You will put a path into, right? You will put, instead of stairs, you're now going to create a rolling pavement so people can use their wheelchairs. when you design for the most vulnerable person, the person that is most disabled, you automatically benefit everybody else, because now all of a sudden old people might want to use it. Delivery people might want to use it. Postal workers will want to use it. Children will want to use it, right? You said by centering the person that is has most sort of challenges in their life, what you've done is made it easier for everybody else. And this really influenced what I wanted to do. And since then, I ended up creating Sacred Earth at the World Wildlife Fund. I ended up creating a program at Yale, and then now I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. All of my programs have centered intersectionality, has centered justice for this reason. And I think all of this for me comes from the Dharma. None of this is something that I woke up one day and just thought, oh, I'm so brilliant. It all came through all my Dharma teachers who were teaching me all along, And so I think this is what I offer to you. If the Dharma can help us reimagine what society should look like, then it should begin. Our imagination should be grounded and rooted by love and compassion. And I think nonviolence too, which is really, really hard. Being Himalayan and of Tibetan, coming from the Tibetan Buddhist community, it's very painful, what is happening in Tibet. And knowing that ultimately, even the protests that happen are nonviolent, essentially, except to the self, right? And the courage that takes, understanding the courage that takes, and the suffering that people are witnessing and experiencing to do that, I think that is, and what is the word I want? That is Dharma in display, in a way, right? To choose to not do violence to someone else. And I think there are nonviolent protests that have happened where people are harmed terribly, terribly. We have a young activist here in the US that was killed very recently in Atlanta by the police, right? For no reason but for protesting. But there is something about, I think, imagining a world that is just, imagining a place that is just, that comes from Dharma principles, that also gives us a lot of compassion in return. And that compassion has to come from understanding that we might not get there in our lifetime, but we're building the path to get there, that we are part of a chain. And we are building a world that we're handing that is more just than the world we inherited, and we're handing it to the next generation to build the next part of it. I sometimes have to remind people have a tendency to really not be able to imagine a world that doesn't have capitalism in it. But capitalism is 500 years old. The system we live in right now, that we cannot even visualize a world without it, that is just a 500-year-old system. And the Dharma is, infinite.
So referring to the kind of continuing on the past question of what activism looks like in Latin America, she's asking, much of that activism is led by women who are structurally displaced from centers of power. And much is also emerging from communities that were colonized and are now struggling to recover their collective environmental history or their relationship to the land that they had cared for or stewarded, but that was forcefully appropriated, taken from them. Could you offer guidance for those of us who are working from positions outside centers of power, who are working from different positions and specifically in organizations of civil society?
Mm. When I was younger, I thought change happened if you worked from the inside, but after all these years of being part of campaigns and designing campaigns, the one thing I've learned, even in a campaign, is that you always have to have people agitating outside the building, even when you have people that are going in to negotiate. You know, the people agitating outside of the building create a kind of pressure that forces powers that never want to give them up to negotiate. And it's not a complete win, right? Part of negotiation means that you lose. It's in the design of negotiation. And for the first half of my career, what I wanted to do was be in the building. Even though I started off very much as an activist who was organizing rallies. And then, as I explained, in 2009, I left everything and I suddenly found myself outside of the building. And I have to tell you, it was the most freeing thing I've ever experienced. I was so free, you know. I could design anything the way I wanted to. And with this purest of motivations and aspirations, and just offer it and sort of trust the universe, that the universe put me here in this time, in this body, in this lifetime for a reason, and just offer it without being attached to what comes next. And there were times when I was creating these things and offering it, thinking, this might never exist. It might just be something I write and 5 people see it and that's it, you know. And there have been plenty of things I've created that have failed, that have taught me, you know, how to do it again and again and again. Some things that I love more than what I've succeeded in. But in the process, what I've realized is that, you know, we have to show people what these things we are dreaming about looks like. When we say, when I talk about degrowth, for example, capitalist degrowth, people cannot even imagine a good life. They immediately think of Mad Max. You know, they immediately think about a world where it's like everything is scary, everyone's fighting, it's all these men, women are in shackles, right? Like, it's so frightening for us. But who better than women to design a world that is one of peace and reciprocity? Everywhere I look, you know, everywhere I look, I see women building. I see women creating these futures. I see, just all the examples of people in my life, teachers, mentors, you know, who have not been trying to scale up, who've not been trying to do the next big thing, who've not been trying to like create a technology that solves the big problem, but who have just trusted in their relationships and built relationships, and built relationships of reciprocity, you know, and kinship and interdependence and compassion. And I think all of that, to me, really goes to say that we when we are outside centers of power, we have a kind of freedom where we are able to not be held back by our history and not be held back by what was handed to us as sort of like, this is the share you get this share, the share that's the afterthought, right? The share where you're the worker, you know, you're never the leader. I think we have this ability to take that back and to say, we'll design it for ourselves. And because we're not in that center of power, we can design it in a way that is actually not tainted or corrupted by power. You know, I think Dharmadatta is one of the great examples of that. You know, I think thinking through how we design communities, how we create safe spaces. I think one of the things we have to understand with climate change is how much migration is going to happen, and how obviously, you know, even the US, all these years we've been trying to fight to have a climate policy in place. Actually, there has been a climate policy. It has been the migrant policy. It has been the borders. and it has been kids in cages. That has been a climate policy for the US, right? And so understanding that a lot of the governments are going to react in that way. They are, without a doubt, being prepared for that. And I think for those of us who have essentially stepped out from these centers of power, thinking through, well, what is it we can do? You know, I think I often talk about the importance of sanctuary builders. And I think that's one way for us to think about it, is we're building sanctuaries for not just ourselves, but everybody that is left out of these centers of power, right? What does that sanctuary look like? Who is it for? You know, it could be that we're building butterfly gardens and the sanctuaries we are creating is for butterflies, right? Or we're doing it for people, you know, or we're doing it for children who are harmed. We're thinking about LGBTQ communities who are targeted, right? But really not feeling, I think, not allowing ourselves to feel disempowered because we have been displaced from these centers of power, but actually instead really claiming a different kind of power, where we get to be free in how we design and implement what, you know, what these different visions look like.